Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Drawn and Quarterly Bookstore's first virtual fall event. I will thank you all now for your amazing patience. As you have probably seen in the last 6 months, everybody is learning to do things in new ways. So thank you again for all your patience. Tonight's very exciting event is the launch for Saleema Nawaz's book, Songs for the End of the World. This beautiful book right here. We are also very excited to have Waubgeshig Rice here to converse with her for the launch. My name is Rebecca Lloyd, and I'm here at our physical bookstore. It is located on the unceded territory of the Ganyangahaga, and while many of us refer to Montreal as our home, it is named Jojage, and we are very grateful that creating and sharing stories has been part of this land for thousands of years, and we urge you to seek out a story that is different from your own. Many of you will be happy to know that both of our bookstores are open for physical browsing and that we now ship Canada-wide. We have many signed copies of Saleema's book available for order online and in our store. So thank you all so much for supporting local independent bookstores like ours. It is because of your support that we continue to offer events like this one. I'll also note that we are hosting 9 different digital book clubs for young readers to adults, and you can find those on our Facebook page. It is always a special pleasure to host local authors, especially ones that we know as well as Saleema. She has been a loyal member of one of our non-official book clubs for quite some time and is a good friend to the store. I have been a big fan of her work since reading her novel Bone and Bread, which was shortlisted for Canada Reads competition in 2016. And if I had had my vote, would have won. I was very lucky to get a copy of her latest book, this one, Songs for the End of the World, while we were in the throes of confinement. And I cannot tell you how eerie it was to read in that context. But you'll get a chance to hear all about that soon. Tonight, we will start with a conversation between Saleema and Wab, followed by a question and answer. As participants, you should be able to see a Q&A function near the bottom, and you should be able to write questions afterwards. So you can do so at any point during the conversation. After questions, I will pop up again and let you know that the evening has wrapped up and remind you once more that you can purchase both authors' books at our store. We are incredibly honored to have Saleema here with Wab. He is the author of The Moon of the Crusted Snow, and he was our dream conversationalist, having written a book about an apocalypse in the Northern First Nation, and as an experienced journalist with the CBC, we couldn't have thought of a better match. And he is joining us from Sudbury, so that's an added treat of virtual launches. We can bring in people from all different places. So I just want to say, Saleema, thank you so much for agreeing to do your virtual launch with us. It seems beyond fitting that for this book, we are all tuning in on our myriad of devices. So please join me from your homes in welcoming them both to the screen.
Hi. Thank you so much for that introduction, Rebecca. I seem to be alone now. Wow, hi.
Hey, hi everybody. Hi Saleema.
Hi.
So I just want to say big thanks to Rebecca for inviting me to be a part of this, and the whole Drawn and Quarterly team, and to you, Saleema, for writing such a wonderful book. This is a huge honor to be a part of this evening tonight, to be a part of your launch. And I'm just very grateful, and I humbly come to you from what's called Michigan the Schnaubbeck's traditional territory here in Sudbury under the Robinson-Huron Treaty. And I will just issue one little disclaimer. I have an almost 4-year-old son and a 3-month-old son here. Our house isn't that big, so we're coming up to bedtime, and you viewers may hear a bit of bedtime chaos here and there, but I'll do my best to get on the mute button if I need to, if it gets a little too loud. So that's my quick disclaimer. And I just wanted to say, Chimigwech, once again, thank you very much. And the first question I have for you, Saleema, is how's it going?
It's going okay. I mean, I feel like this time is so strange and challenging, and every day has a lot of like emotional ups and downs, even though it's all kind of part of this weird sameness. But overall, okay. I can't complain. How are you doing?
Well, we're making literary events happen to the best of our abilities with the technology, right? So
exactly.
It's cool to be able to do this tonight. So I've got a lot of questions for you. I just wanted to say I loved Songs for the End of the World. It's a wonderful book, just a tremendous spirit in the book that I really love that I'll get to ask you about later. I feel very fortunate for this opportunity. But I guess the big question that probably everybody has that we should probably get out of the way first is, what's it like to have a book about a global pandemic be published during a global pandemic?
Yeah, it's super surreal. It hasn't stopped being surreal. If anything, it's only become more strange, because I guess for the ebook, so the ebook was released early. This is like the longest book launch probably in history, because it's sort of the ebook came out early in April, and the print book, nowish, and yeah, like it seemed very strange in April. I couldn't believe it was happening, and all through March before the ebook came out, and now as I've been doing a few readings, and I've been going to the book to like find passages to read here and there, and actually encountering the text again, because I hadn't really looked at it since I did the copy edits in November or whatever, like way before COVID, and so like reading some of those passages again. Like I'm sort of struck all over again by some of the weird parallels.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the ebooks release back in the spring. What was the conversation around that like? Were you and the publisher essentially like, okay, we should get something up for the time being, and then have something huger later, or what happened there? How did that all come together?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't privy necessarily to all the conversations that were happening at the publishing company about it. Like certainly, they were tracking COVID, from a very early point, and they were like, well, you've probably noticed there's a novel coronavirus, like we're hoping it's going to be contained, and and then sort of as when the pandemic was declared, I think they had a lot of conversations, and my feeling was like I had this, like I felt a certain urgency to getting it out, because like I felt like I had so much to say about this topic, but nobody knew I had written this, and so it felt like, to me, I was like, yes, let's like put it out sooner, please. And I think there's because it was ready to go, but I guess there's certain holdups in like actually printing, and I think given the pandemic, that slowed things down as well. So they couldn't actually, release it earlier as a print book. Yeah, but so I think they did it as quickly as they could, and I was definitely in favor of it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Obviously, for sure. I mean, we'll talk more about the current pandemic a little later, because we sort of have to. It's the news peg as we my former broadcasting side emerges there, right? So, there is that publisher's note that opens the book, and it explains how you worked on this story from 2013 to 2019, and the extensive research you conducted, and so on. But just to get back to the very beginning, what inspired you to create this story?
Well, there were sort of two elements. One was that I had a bunch of sort of characters and stories and scenarios that I wanted to bring together. And so that was one element. And the other element was wanting to tell a disaster story that was kind of a bit more optimistic, that kind of said something different about human nature than some disaster stories say. And a pandemic just seemed like the right kind of disaster that would connect a lot of people, because obviously that's something that the virus does as well. It connects us even, tangentially to one another.
Mm-hmm. And the research you did, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I did a lot of research because, I don't have a science background at all. And so I kept trying to ground everything in realism, but all the reading I did seemed to require more reading to understand what I was reading. So, I read a lot about like agent-based modeling and epidemiology papers on PubMed, and then needing to go, read more about that. And a lot about the 1918 flu pandemic, a lot about the response to SARS and sort of lessons learned from SARS and reconstructions of SARS. And then as sort of every new epidemic happened while I was writing this book, because like a lot happened during the years I was writing it. So like Ebola and MERS and stuff. And then I would sort of track, how that unfolded, and like, were there new ways of responding or containing things, papers that emerged sort of in the wake of those epidemics.
Wow, super interesting. Now, in the story in Songs for the End of the World, we see the pandemic play out through the lives and relationships of a handful of core characters that you've developed, and the story occurs across sort of a staggered timeline. So why did you want to structure the story in that way?
The structure was probably the trickiest part of the book, and part of why it took so long to write, because I had so many characters and because I wanted to have so many different voices in the story, and trying to bring all of those together was challenging, and sort of having the suspense of the pandemic and having the sort of inherent drama of that remain at the forefront. But I still wanted to like delve into all of these backstories. Like I would sometimes in my overwriting that didn't make it into the book really like got into the backstories of all these characters. So it was part of the editing process, was paring some of that away and keeping to this present timeline of the unfolding of the pandemic.
Right. Cool. Well, and the characters are just, there's a depth to each of them, right? That just, you can't help but connect with them as you're enduring the end of the world through them in many ways, right? So like the catastrophe of the pandemic, Aramis, in your story, it looms over everything, and it's always there, much like COVID-19 in our lives right now, right? But I found, the focus of the book is really like the intimate connections between these core characters. So you talked a bit about all the work you did in developing them, but how did you sort of develop those intimate connections and how they relate with each other as a result of the pandemic, essentially?
Yeah, well, that was sort of the fun part of planning the book, was kind of like imagining how these different characters that I'd come up with at different times, where I'd written certain stories or chapters, how I could connect them, and drawing those sort of lines between them in my mind was really fun. That was like one of the most fun parts of writing it. Cool. But in a way too, like it kind of creates a sort of endlessly modular structure, and that you could be like, oh, well, I could also write about this person that's mentioned here, or like this person that's mentioned there. And then realizing, oh, okay, I can't write about, 30 people or, whatever. It has to kind of like bring it down to something that can fit in a book. But yeah, I know that I, experience a lot of pleasure when I'm reading something and I make those connections. So I kind of wanted to put that in there.
Cool. So one character in particular I want to ask about now, mostly because, you and I are both writers. Owen, he's a novelist. Yeah. He's written about the end of the world, and, when a similar crisis happens in his real life, in the book, it has a profound impact on him in many ways. So do you relate with Owen at all, now that we're going through a similar pandemic ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I inevitably I do. And when this was like in March, So Owen is this character, as you say, he's a writer. He's written a pandemic novel that's sort of seems to be coming true in the book, and he like has a very like self-protective reaction. Like he's very like you know, anti any contact, and really withdraws from the world. And but he's not necessarily the most like admirable character in all ways, you know. And so when this was like back in March, when sort of things were first starting to happen in the lockdown here, I was like conscious of like trying not to be like Owen. Like there's certain things that like maybe I would do, but I was like, well, would Owen do that? I don't want to be like Owen. I don't want to like, I was getting into almost a kind of superstitious like frame of mind around trying not to be too much like him, even though it was like sort of in a similar position. Yeah.
Yeah. And Owen, I found like a lot of the characters, you know, he's slightly detached from reality, and then reality comes up and really slaps him in the face. And you know, I may have interpreted this maybe a little, or I may have overthought this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you anyway. You know, there is sort of this detachment from reality with a lot of the characters, like Elliot, the police officer. He can't commit to things in his life. He's sort of maybe ignoring or escaping his privileged past. You know, Owen is, as mentioned, wrapped up in that fictional world, and he's neglectful of his wife. And Edith, you know, the so-called patient zero, stereotypically seems to have some inner identity conflicts. And Emma, she and her family are on that, you know, perpetual nautical like cruise or lifestyle, right? Then she and Stu become rock stars in the end, right? But all these characters are sort of brought back down to earth and to reality because of the pandemic, and they're ultimately brought back to human connections, I think, as a result of that. So is that something you intended to get across?
That's so interesting. You know, I hadn't really thought about how many of them were disconnected from reality in that way, but that's certainly true. And definitely, yeah, that theme of like needing other people and needing human connection, even though, yeah, a lot of these characters are kind of living in a life of the mind, or living in kind of a fictional world, or in quite a protected bubble. Yeah, so yeah, they all are kind of in their own different kinds of bubbles. But yeah, this sense of a crisis needing to make them realize that they need other people.
I think as a result of that, like the story ultimately becomes pretty hopeful, you know, and in many ways, it doesn't read like, you know, the stereotypical post-apocalyptic or dystopian story. Is that hopeful spirit something you wanted to get across too?
Yeah, absolutely. Like that was something that I was thinking about like from the beginning with this book. And that's part of why Owen has written, you know, a pandemic novel in the novel as well, because I'm really interested in that sense of like what stories tell us about the world and how we carry that with us sometimes, even if we're not super aware of it. Because I know I love, you know, watching disaster movies and reading post-apocalyptic novels, and then you know, wondering like, oh, what would I do if there was, you know, such a scenario like this? And and like thinking about how much of my thinking about that is like has been framed by, you know, what you see on screen or what you've read about, you know, people turning on one another and you know, and sort of, so it came from wondering like, what does that impact on us, and is that even really true? And like, maybe if we have a different kind of blueprint of how to behave, maybe if this really happens, it could go better.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I enjoy that perspective. Are there any books from that so-called, I guess, post-apocalyptic canon that influenced or inspired you in your writing?
Well, I was trying to stay away from plague novels while I was writing it, although I did read and super loved Station 11. But I guess that sort of the disaster fare that I've tended to enjoy are kind of those like Hollywood movies where like everything is getting blown up, like where you see all of the like world monuments like being destroyed and like civilization is over. So I wouldn't say that those inspired this, but there was that like, you know, why do I like that kind of feeling in the back of my mind.
Well, it's like, you see, well, there are interpretations of, renewal or society hitting the reset button in some ways too, right? And I think, finding a hopeful thread in that is really great. And I think a lot of people are going to seek that out right now. And do you find, like, the early response you've gotten, that's what people are latching onto, is that they want a story like this right now?
Yeah, I think that's sort of been like what I've heard. And also another thing I've heard is just that it's hard right now to think about anything besides the pandemic, like people who are just, constantly refreshing the news. And so for people who are kind of in that zone, it's like, it's a good book to read because you don't actually have to stop thinking about the pandemic. You can continue to think about it. And I know not everyone falls into that camp, but that's something that people have told me.
When I was reading it, I couldn't help but reflect on things that have actually happened over the last 6 months and how they relate or how they play out in your book. Did that concern you at all, that people might compare the book a little too much to reality and maybe not necessarily connect with it, or maybe be a little too critical of it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I haven't worried about it in the sense that, the book was finished and it's out there and I'm happy, I'm happy it's out in the world. And so there's nothing I can control about that. But I've definitely found myself doing that as well, like having this sort of perspective of like, oh, well, did I get that right? Or did I get that wrong? And it's like, well, it's just a novel. It's not like, I wasn't trying to make a prediction about what would actually happen. Like, it was just, I was trying to make it realistic, but it's completely made up. So I've tried to get away from that. Like, did I get it right? Did I get it wrong? Even though I can't help doing that as well. So yeah, it's natural, exactly. I think. Yeah.
In that sense too, some people may say you're prescient, by following this pandemics over the last, almost decade and then writing a novel about it. How do you feel about that label or that term being applied to you in your book?
I mean, there's a part of me, so there's two parts. There's like the part that's like, well, it's not that prescient because, epidemiologists have been saying this, for years, that it's not a matter of if, it's when, they've been saying it's going to happen. And certainly if all the information that I was able to draw on to make this seem so realistic, it's like all out there. It's like in the public domain. So like, it wasn't that hard to imagine, like all of these sort of details that I have about social distancing and quarantine, and like that's all in the literature of like, what do you do if there's a pandemic? So all of that is out there. So I don't think it's especially prescient in that way. But then there's another part of it, like the part of me that wants to be like, I'm always right, I told you so, like the part that my husband knows, and like also the part of me that's like, a 16-year-old girl, like, who was like doing tarot readings, where I'm just like, yes, I am, prescient, but it's not really true.
Well, when I was reading it and right away when Elliot has to go into that 21-day lockdown, I was like, okay, buckle up, here we go. Like I was like locked in and committed from that point. So, but then, it sort of made this, just the way that it explored each of these characters and their sort of, mentalities and their emotions and so on. And I found like, during this time, like we're all in isolation and we're all becoming very introspective, right? And we're all considering our relationships with each other, our loved ones, our communities, our wider sort of nations, I guess. And in some ways, I think it's this book really reflects that reality in that sense, because we've had a lot of time to think. So is that what you hope people take away from this? Is that, they've become vulnerable and they become a little more, well, hopefully tolerant, we'll ignore the whole anti-mask thing for now, but
oh my gosh.
Just sort of opening their minds to creating a better world. Is that what you sort of hope to get across too?
I mean, that would be amazing, for sure. I mean, I think there's always the part of you that just, I mean, as a writer, I just want to tell a story that people can like disappear into and like be entertained by and like identify with the characters. But then, yeah, like underlying that, you have like, you know, higher goals of like, what is it that you're really trying to say about the world? And yeah, those would be things that I would hope somebody could take away from it for sure.
So, you know, you're an author, veteran author by now. You've done the routine, the launch and the book readings and so on. What's it like now to have this all just happen virtually for the time being?
Well, it's, you know, there are some upsides. I think, you know, I feel more comfortable not being up on a stage. It's nice to just sort of be at home in a way, even though it's like, it's sad not to like, you know, be able to meet readers or meet other writers in person. It's also pretty cool to hang out with you in this virtual space, and to be able to like drop in on events, you know, all over the world. I've gotten to like, just like as a reader and a fan, like attend other literary events, you know, in other cities, which has been great. So
yeah, I agree. You know, having, you know, a newborn baby, I wasn't expecting to be able to do, I wouldn't have been expecting to be able to do anything in real life right now anyway, because it would have been home, you know, taking care and so on. But now I'm, yeah, as you mentioned, dropping into all these awesome things happening virtually everywhere, you know. And as much as I love Montreal, it would have been great to come in person. You know, that might not have been a possibility given I'm all the way up here in Sudbury, right? So, so yeah, I think this is pretty neat. It's pretty cool to see. So yeah, I just have a few more questions about the book and just some stuff in general. But I want to remind everybody that we are taking questions in about 10 minutes or so time. So there's that Q&A box if you're on Zoom. Make sure you type a question in there, and I will moderate them as we go. And yeah, we also want to give a shout out to people watching on Facebook and YouTube as well, I believe. And make sure you tell your friends that if they didn't catch this live tonight, that it is being recorded and that they will be able to stream it later on. So, but also big thanks to everybody joining in tonight. And again, this is really cool to be a part of. So getting back to the characters, you know, we already talked about Owen quite extensively. Were there any others that you really, you know, favored or, you know, had a soft spot for?
Yeah, I mean, I have a big soft spot for Emma, who's the character who's a singer, and we also see her as a child sailing around the world with her family. And so she is sort of the character who's been around the longest. Like, I think I wrote that sort of what's become a chapter as a sort of extended story when I was doing my master's. So she has been around in my mind for a long time, her and her sister on this boat. And I guess I relate to her the most because she's a bit like more disconnected from the other characters, and that she, as you said, she's in this rock band and she's kind of connecting to everybody through, you know, her art and her music. But yeah, at a certain point, I think I had imagined her being kind of the main character. But because she is so sort of disconnected, it just ended up working out better to make Elliot, who's on the ground. He's a police officer, so he's just like more in contact with what's going on every day. It sort of made more sense to shift the focus to him. So, but I still have a soft spot for Emma, my maybe former protagonist.
And you know, the musical elements are so powerful throughout. Was music a big part of the creative process for you when you were getting this together?
Well, I'm a huge music fan, and I think that's one of the things I miss most about this lockdown is going to shows and stuff like that. So certainly, like, imagining the musical parts of this were fun for me, and I like wrote some of the sort of made up band songs. It was like a fun side project in the, you know, endless years I was writing the book. Yeah, I find it hard to write to music. Like sometimes when I'm in a cafe and they're playing music, then that's like different. But yeah.
Yeah, I have to write to instrumental music or music with no discernible lyrics. Otherwise, I get too distracted. So.
Yeah, exactly.
So don't want to get too deep into some of the details in case some viewers haven't read it yet, and I don't want to, you know, give any spoilers away. But there is, I guess, a bit of a twist towards the end with Elliot's character. He discovers something about himself or his background, and as a result of something he did when he was younger. And I wanted to know, is that sort of hinting at some sort of cure or some sort of resolution to the whole situation?
Some sort of, I missed the first word, some sort of.
Oh, like some sort of cure to the sickness, or some sort of resolution, or
Yeah, well, I think there is a hint in there for sure. That was like part of the intention. Yeah, I should say like the book kind of. The book takes us through the first like 5 months or so of the pandemic, or from like July to 5 or 6 months. So there's still some uncertainty, I guess, at the end. Although I hope it's still a satisfying ending.
Yeah, and that was a bit of a selfish question on my end, because that was the one thing that I really, really struck me, and I really thought it was an interesting way to sort of hint at a way it's going to wrap up. So just a reminder, if you have any questions about the book for Saleema, and anything else that's come up in our conversation so far, feel free to add them into the Q&A box there. So how does it feel now, like this book is officially out, although it's been out in electronic form since the spring? We talked about that so-called canon of disaster or post-apocalyptic stories moments ago, but how does it feel to be able to contribute to these stories, and to, in the future, people are going to reference this? How does that feel?
I mean, it feels cool. It's great to be like in great company also with your book, which I'm going to Moon of the Crusted Snow, which is a great book, and which I still think about, have been thinking about a lot since I read it. It's, I mean, I think it's important for us to like imagine these scenarios, and imagine, and there's a reason why there's so many iterations of writers imagining these kinds of things, because, plagues do happen, and disaster does strike, and it always helps to imagine what we're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are like, I don't want to sound too morbid, but they are kind of fun discussions to have, right? Like thinking about how you'd respond to these situations. And with Moon of the Crusted Snow, thank you very much for reading it and for honoring me with your thoughts. I really appreciate that. But people have said to me, and it got, I guess, a bit of a bump as a result of the pandemic too. People have asked, how they've also used the word prescient, and like there's not a whole lot in Moon of the Crusted Snow that really compares directly to what we're going through now, like except for like panic buying at stores and just the general mystery, right? Like at this point now, we don't really know how this is all going to end, and I think that really compels people to these kinds of stories, because it sort of makes them vulnerable, right? And I think having those discussions prompted is really good thing. And I just hope people can sort of remember how they felt during this time. And I don't know if you agree with that, but I think that's
Totally.
Sort of the discussion that we want to see perpetuating after these stories are, sort of on the shelves for a couple of years, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think like we often like look to stories like that because of uncertainty, and we want stories that give us an answer, that tell us how it's going to turn out, but I think that's what I so appreciate are stories that, allow us to have that uncertainty and which are more realistic, and like which just,
like they're relatable.
allow us, they're relatable. And it's also like, it's not like, part of what I wanted to write about was, it's like, okay, what if you're not the person that's on the rocket ship that's being flown into the asteroid heading to Earth? Like, what if you're not that person? You're just a normal person with an, everyday life. And how do you exist in this time of uncertainty?
Mm-hmm. And one other thing that reminds me that I really appreciated about your book is there was a whole issue of food security that arose. And another thing I think we've all sort of realized is that those of us living in cities are quite removed from our food sources, essentially, right? Like, we're really reliant upon food coming in from elsewhere and us going to buy it at the superstore or whatever else, right? Or the dépanneur, even on the corner. And I think we've seen some discussions come up about communities figuring out how to create gardens or better ways to make food sustainable within their communities. So was that something you really wanted to touch on too? Was just that importance of knowing about food?
Well, I mean, if anything, I don't know if I thought about it as much. I've certainly thought about it a lot more since the this real pandemic has struck, and that's something. I mean, all of that kind of the things that we take for granted in cities is something that's explored so beautifully in your book. Like, what if you can't depend on heat? What if you can't depend on all of these things? And yeah, I mean, that is one of the sort of silver linings, if you will, is that I think it's a time for us to reevaluate so many things that we've taken for granted about our current society and the upsides and the downsides of the way that we live.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Agreed, 100%. Okay, I think I will click open this Q&A box down here in the corner, and we'll see what our lovely attendees have to ask. So this is a good question. Have you had any interesting fan mail or audience responses to this book?
I have not had any fan mail or interesting. I mean, I've had very nice reader responses, people who enjoyed the book. But nothing that I would say is super unusual or out of the way.
That'll come though. I think like it's officially being launched just now, right? And now that it's in stores, I think there'll be a lot more discussion coming. Another question here is there anything you'd change about the book now that you're living through a real pandemic?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't think I would change anything just because I spent so long working on it. There's nothing I would like less than to keep working on it, especially since it kind of feels like I'm continuing to live through it all the time, every day. But there's certainly lots of things that are interesting that are happening that, like, because I spend so long kind of always being alert to any kind of like epidemic headline and like reading the story for like interesting things I could use. And now it's like every day, like every single headline is like that. And so certainly beginning, like I still had that kind of like hair trigger reaction of being like, oh, is there something I can use? And it's like, no, it's like the book's done. And there's certainly all sorts of things that have been interesting and impossible for me to imagine, like the widespreadness. I mean, I put some conspiracy theorists in the novel, but nothing like the degree to which we've seen, or the anti-maskers, or all sorts of kind of unbelievable truth stranger than fiction things that have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the beauty of speculative fiction too, though, is you speculate, that's your artistic vision too, right? And that's how you see it playing out. So there's no matter how much research or how much you try to pin something down, there's always going to be something weirder that pops up in real life, I think.
Definitely.
So here's another question, and just a reminder, I see some questions coming up in the chat, but if you could direct them to the Q&A box just to the right. We're trying to sort of corral them there just to have a little more collective sort of response. Here's another question. Any nonfiction pandemic books / literature you recommend from the research that you did?
Oh, yeah. Well, so a lot of the research I did was just online, like PubMed, like articles, or like news stories or sort of documents produced by cities, like emergency preparedness plans. But one book that I did find when I was sort of wondering, like, is my hopeful take on the pandemic like realistic? Is that backed up in anything besides my own like wishful thinking that people won't all be terrible? And in the process of looking that up, I found this book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell, which I think I have here. I can show you. And so it's sort of like looking at different disasters across time and the sociology of disaster and which sort of bears out the theory that, you know, most people will behave well in a disaster. You know, like there may be an element where they don't, but generally, unless people have been given a reason to like, unless fear has been sown by authorities who are afraid of panic or something, which almost never actually happens, then people will behave well. So that's a book I really recommend.
All right, great. Here's a question from a fellow author, from Brent Van Staldynen. Sorry, Brent, if I mispronounced your last name, but it's a question for both of us. Brent asks, after researching pandemics and other calamities, do you feel more prepared for when things go sideways?
I don't think I do feel more prepared, to be honest. Like, I feel like I know what I should do, but not really. I don't know. How about you?
When I started, I was like just in the grips of, you know, disaster scenarios, right? And I kept thinking constantly about making plans and having a bug out bag, which we do have, you know, just in case. But you know, I started gung-ho on it for the first like little bit, the first few months or so as I was writing. And, you know, we did get some gear together, but I think if there was something that happened tonight or tomorrow, I don't think I'm prepared, quite honestly. So, but yeah, it's funny because my wife, Sarah, read the first draft of Moon of the Crusted Snow years ago. And she sort of had that infect her mind too. And she was always texting me saying, you know, make sure you have at least a half tank of gas in your car and things like that, right? So some little things, but no, I'm not as prepared either as I think we should be.
Yeah, I feel like I've had a lot of conversations about what we should do, and, you know, and I've like bookmarked the, you know, the wind up radio or whatever, but I've never actually like acquired the things. Like, I have the mental list of the things, but I haven't done the things.
So another question that I think you covered, is there an aspect of the current pandemic you hadn't foreseen? And you mentioned, you know, the conspiracy theories and the anti-maskers and all that. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Or?
I guess you know, some of the stuff at, like, when we were all on lockdown, where, you know, the kind of environmental, like the way the sort of carbon emissions like immediately went down, and, you know, the goats in the street or whatever, that was kind of cool to see those things.
And you talked about the Rebecca Solnit book you read in your research. Question here is, have you read anything lately that you want to give a shout out to?
Oh, what have I read lately? How to Pronounce Knife is a beautiful short story collection. Mm-hmm. I recommend. It's on the Giller long list. I'm drawing a blank.
Songs for the End of the World. That's what I read recently that I love. So here's a great question that I wonder too. Were Dove Sweet modeled after any real band?
No, and they were sort of inspired by a lot of bands that I like. Yeah. I'll stop there.
I could, you know, the way you describe them, I could hear them, you know, just that sort of modern sort of pop rock kind of sound, which I think came through loud and clear too. So here's a question. You sort of touched on this a bit, but if you want to go a little deeper on it, how do you think the book might have been different if you wrote it during or after this current pandemic?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I mean, first of all, I don't think I would write it, because I think part of a lot of like the writing that I've done has been out of like a curiosity to imagine a scenario I haven't lived through. You know, so my short story collection, Mother Superior, had a lot of, you know, people having babies, you know, which I hadn't done, like parents and kids and stuff. And Bone and Bread involves these two sisters, and I'm an only child. And so I was kind of like imagining what that would be like. So this was really, I was trying to imagine what it would be like to live in a time period like right now. And so, yeah, I wouldn't write about it. I don't think, having lived through it.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. I'm not sure if I would either, you know, so. Here's a question from Aaron. Since you have both written post-apocalyptic novels, I'm curious from both of you, has this pandemic changed the way you thought about anything, whether it's your own life or our own society?
That's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would say, while you think about it, Saleema, I am slightly disheartened, you know, as hopeful as a person as I try to be, and everything I said about people, you know, being a little more introspective and considerate of themselves and their communities. I am a little dismayed with, you know, the conspiracy theories and sort of how that has really taken hold. And, you know, I see it thrive amongst some people that I went to high school with and that kind of thing. So, yeah, that's been a little discouraging, but, you know, all you can do is really try to stay hopeful, you know, and just try to work through it together as a community. I think that's the spirit we have to try to uphold in many ways. What about you? Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, you know, similarly, I felt quite disheartened at times, but then, you know, have had to sort of remember, okay, it's still a minority of people who are behaving that way. And I guess if anything, it's underlined to me the importance of, you know, good leadership, and, you know, the dangers of people with dangerous views like coming into power, and really how setting an example like can make such a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, positive or negative.
Yeah. And then, yeah, that's a great reminder. You know, there's a very vocal minority that's been empowered by social media, right? That seems to be very loud. So, yeah, we just got to remind ourselves that hopefully common sense prevails.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Alice. Do you want to say anything about your decision where to set the novel, in New York City and in New England?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I mean, I think at a very early point, I had planned to have it in Toronto, some of the scenes that are in New York. But I was kind of imagining like sort of a greater population density for a virus to really take hold, and also kind of just like a more dangerous backdrop, you know, like if everyone has access to guns, or like if everyone, like if the society is more fractured and like more susceptible to polarizing forces, there's just more of that sense of danger of everything kind of going off of the rails. And I think too, it was also kind of almost like too painful to like imagine like writing some of those scenes in Toronto. It's kind of like mean, but like it felt too close to have that happen.
Here's a question from Douglas. Have you had people in your community who may be a model for your next writing? And he gives a shout out to snow being here soon, and that snowshoes are ready because Moon of the Crescent Snow. But yeah, are there people in your community who, may be a model for your next writing?
Like as in that I would write about them? I hope not. I am not. I'm just gonna say no. I don't think so. But it's hard to know sometimes where real life is gonna like pop into your novel. Like sometimes I feel like we're not even always like conscious of it, and then you realize later, like, oh, that was from that thing that happened a really long time ago. Or
yeah, I've found people in my family or community try to see themselves in different characters, right? And that can be an awkward conversation sometimes.
Yeah.
Here's a question about the audiobook. I've been listening to and loving the audiobook edition. Were you involved, and what was that like?
Oh yeah, that was really cool. The audiobook, it was put together during lockdown, so they could only use voice actors, who had a really good, home studio, and they really went all out. So all of the different characters are voiced, like all the chapters from different perspectives are voiced by different actors, which I think is so cool. Yeah, and so yeah, I was involved just in getting to kind of listen to the auditions and sort of have a voice in sort of saying, oh, I think this person sounds, more like Owen, or this person sounds more like Sarah. And I got to read the credits. So that was really fun.
That's neat.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting question that I'm wondering too. What's the big difference between writing now than before the pandemic occurred? Have you found your creative process is changing at all, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's been hard. It's harder. I feel like just everything is harder right now. It's harder to stay focused. It's harder to find time. I've been home with a 5-year-old pretty much, 24/7. So it's hard to find the time to write. And then when you do have the time, I personally, I found it quite challenging. But it's just that kind of sense of like needing to slog away at it, like bit by bit. You try to just do it. You just sort of do what you can, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Question from Tom. Just in case Saleema's 16-year-old self was right all along, when will there be a vaccine?
I do not want to prognosticate on what's going to happen. I feel like so many people are working on it. It could really I have no idea.
Yeah, that's the $20 billion question right now, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one hopes sooner rather than later, but.
Yeah. Here's a question from Josh. Several of your characters seem to be, quote, outsiders, like Edith, Jericho, Emma. You mentioned the thinker livingness. Are you particularly interested in the idea of the outsider?
Oh, good question. I don't know that I'm particularly interested in the idea of the outsider, but I probably just have always felt like an outsider. So that's probably one of those, like, I'll take it up if I ever go into therapy questions, I think,
Here's another one. We've talked about Dove Sweet a bit, but Lawrence is wondering if you could share some of the hypothetical band names you rejected before settling on Dove Sweet.
Dove Sweet actually was the first name that occurred to me. It was like, I'm gonna think of a band, Dove Sweet, yeah. So there were no other fictional band names.
So a question here, and I guess this turns the tables to the experts in some ways, or on them. As a writer who conducted a lot of research, do you have any advice for scientists trying to prepare for upcoming disasters or other pandemics?
Oh my gosh. Well, I wouldn't attempt to give advice to scientists. Although from the beginning I was saying we should all be wearing masks, but that wasn't really down to the scientists so much as like policymakers. So yeah, I think we should be listening to them, not to me, listening to the scientists.
And another question here, Saleema, what are you working on now?
I'm working on like 5 different things, like very slowly. A novel sort of set in Montreal, but like in the past, not imagining the future. I'm working on a musical, again, set in the past. Really like past looking right now. I'm just really focused on not what's going to happen in the future.
And this next question is sort of along those lines. It may be a little too specific, and you may not want to go down this path. But the question is: I love your approach of only writing about things you haven't experienced or can only imagine doing. Any thought to writing something with time travel and altering the past, like the butterfly effects and so on? Your writing style is well suited to such a story. Great job on the book. I love it.
Oh, thanks. Well, listen, I love stories with time travel, but I don't think I'm brave enough to write one because I feel like as soon as you start, it's like that paradox of when you start to think about it, then it like all falls apart. And I'm too easily confused by timelines when I'm writing. So I don't want to set myself the task of writing something with like ultra confusing timelines. I think it would be too hard, but yeah, love time travel.
So I think this is probably the last question right now. Unless Rebecca, do you need to come in and?
Nope, last question. I'll get out.
This is a cool question too that I'm interested in. Both of your books have such evocative titles. Did you have them all along, or were there others?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, for this, the original title was like the working title for a long time was How to Avoid the Plague. And that has become sort of the title of Owen's book within the book. But then, you know, while I was writing it, there was a documentary about the AIDS epidemic called, with a very similar title, not like How to Survive the Plague, I think. And then that was turned into, like, there was a book about the documentary, and then I think they were turning it into a series. So just I was like, okay, I have to like let go of that title. And this title was like very hard to arrive at. Like I had like a whole spreadsheet, but you know, kind of eventually landed on this one. And there was some kind of concern after the real pandemic happened that maybe it was too dark of a title, or like there was talk of like maybe it needs to change, like so it doesn't sound like I'm saying it's the end of the world. But we stuck with it.
Nice. Well, I love the title too. That'll do it for me. I believe Rebecca from Drawn and Quarterly is going to come back in. Just want to say chimigwech to everybody for tuning in. Saleema, thanks for a great conversation. Thanks for writing such a beautiful book. And
thanks so much to you.
Happy to be here. So Rebecca, take it away. Thanks everybody.
Again, yeah, basically what you said, Wob. Thank you, Saleema. Thank you, Wob. Thank you both. It's so wonderful to hear you talk about both your works, and what a dream this is for us. I mean, for me, to hear you guys speak together, I'm just so happy that you were able to connect. Really, this was the dream matchup that we had been hoping for. So everybody, now you know, pick up these books and any other books that you need. And thank you all for tuning in to Drawn and Quarterly's very first fall virtual event. Have a wonderful evening and take care.